Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching this webinar. Appreciate everyone's time today. My name is Jay Pitzer. I work for Enable and been with the company for 3 years. Today, we're excited to talk to one of our partners, our very close partners, about DNS technologies and the threats that happen at the edge of the internet. So today, we're going to spend as much time as possible. We've got an hour slotted here. Our last threat webinar lasted a full hour, but just a couple housekeeping things. Please, if you have questions, we're going to try to be very interactive through the questions section. So drop down the questions and put your questions in there, and I'll try to inject those into the conversation today. So we have a nice free-flowing conversation with everyone. So let's get started. So just briefly, just to make sure that anything we say here, any information regarding future features or functionality should not be interpreted as a commitment from Enable. So let's get that out of the way real quick. So who do we have today? So many of you probably have been on webinars and know Dave McKinnon from our team. Dave's been here almost 2 years. So Dave's background definitely worked for larger organizations, AT&T and so forth as a CISO. Here came on with Enable, SolarWinds, then Enable, and has been an awesome asset to our organization. Our guest speaker today is Ken Carnesi. Ken actually worked for an MSP for almost 10 years, probably about 10 years, and worked on large network deployments, Wi-Fi and such. And one of the things that Ken and his co-founder Brian, I believe, they ran into a situation that a lot of us run into, are the tools aren't meeting my needs as an MSP. So Ken and his co-founder started DNSFilter years ago, and it is one of the best DNS filtering products on the market today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to just kind of have this open chat between Dave and Ken, and we're going to follow some topics that we've already have listed. But please, we want to lead this conversation in directions that you all want to hear. So again, use the questions drop down, enter your questions there, and I'll monitor those. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave now, and they're going to start the chat, and I'm going to drop the slides. So best of luck.
Best of luck. Boy, can you make it sound like a inquisition? No, I mean, so everybody, I appreciate you all joining. As Jay had said, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. Our only ask between Ken and I is that you only ask questions we know the answers to, because it does make this a lot easier for us. So Ken, I appreciate you joining us today. I guess I'll start with a question for you. Jay had mentioned you've got a lot of experience in the MSP space. You've seen that kind of evolve over time. How have you seen kind of the threat landscape change in the last, 5, 10, 15 years for those MSPs as cybersecurity has just evolved in terms of from a threat landscape perspective?
Sure, thanks. Thanks for having me too. So I think, yeah, it's changed a lot. I mean, I sort of stopped doing the MSP. I had started an MSP in 2007, sort of a hybrid between an MSP and a wireless internet service provider, doing, as Jay said, designing, deploying, and maintaining really large Wi-Fi networks. And yeah, I mean, so we started DNSFilter though ultimately in late 2015, and I think there's a lot that's changed in that time. So I think, like, for me, one thing is just that the awareness has really heightened, for sure. We're constantly, I think, reading about new threats and attacks at a rate that just simply was not imaginable, I think, in 2014 and 15. And also the attack surface has become so much more broad. So timing and detection is much more insanely critical now. And I think what I mean by that, and like the surface area broadening, is just like you've got valid and reputable cloud services that are now being leveraged for command and control. You've got increasingly complex and accurate social engineering and spear phishing attacks going after really targeted individuals. I mean, I get 10 or 15 a week just coming after me at DNSFilter. You've got tons of IoT out there that's completely unmonitored and in many cases unpatched. And it's just like there's such a necessity to stay ahead. I mean, I think whereas back in 2014 or earlier, it seemed like hackers were more trying to steal data. I'll say that today it's much more about destroying data or making it inaccessible and trying to ruin a business, like from a data threat to operational threat. And they've realized that it's just much more lucrative to disrupt operations these days than try to steal and sell data.
Yeah, no,
So,
I agree. I definitely think there's been I've always kind of made the analogy of it depends upon where in the world the attack is coming from, determines the motivation. Like, is it cache or IP? And based upon who's looking at you, that oftentimes will determine what they're going to try and extract from you. And candidly, like you could look at ransomware attacks and things like that. I think the average payout somewhere in excess of $250,000 per attack. There's just a lot of money on the table. Like it's no longer just the easy, hey, we're going to take these records, we're going to sell them. Like you take like Target, like we talk about supply chain, everybody talks about supply chain attacks. Target happened, what, in 2010, I think, somewhere around there.
I think so.
I mean, what's your take on kind of supply chain attacks and kind of how is that evolving? Do you see it evolving? You take Colonial, or you can take Uber, or you take Rockstar Games. They were just announced over the weekend, like all these big names kind of making headlines. What's your take on supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those. It's a really broad question. I mean, it's one of those situations where, yeah, I mean, supply chain's a huge threat. I mean, there's and it affects MSPs in huge ways. I mean, there's sort of like the end target, I guess you'll say, and then there's the MSP. So for MSPs, I think that it's affected them in huge ways. Like they've kind of moved, as you can see, with all the different government initiatives and notices going out, that they're basically the epicenter, because it's just that it's the most basic way that they might be able to sort of get through to all the vendors ultimately that an MSP services. It's the easiest way and to get into those networks. But from a supply chain perspective, I mean, it can be hugely damaging. I mean, it's just, I don't even know how to answer the question. I mean, it depends. Like there's so many supply chains, and we talk a lot with like DoD type vendors and some of the things that they're trying to do, and the security. They almost treat themselves as an MSP, or have to start treating themselves as an MSP to enact certain security protocols on their vendors. I mean, it's a complex issue.
It is, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the pivoting has changed quite a bit, where now the MSPs, I think, are squarely in the crosshairs of those attacks, because it's a one-to-many relationship, and you can kind of work your way down and target, whether it be a handful of customers, a specific customer, whatever the case may be. So I agree, it was probably too general of a question, but definitely something I've seen just from, because I'm new to the MSP space. Like, you've got all this experience, but I'm still the new guy in a lot of regards. Like I came from big enterprise, and it's a very different ecosystem. So, with that being said, I guess, what is something, again, with your experience, like, that you think MSPs aren't necessarily prepared for or haven't really thought about as it comes to cyber attacks and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I think that basically it's they have to be able to answer the question now of to a customer or prospective customer, sort of how will you stop this from happening to my business, and have a real serious plan. Like, as we said, MSPs are being targeted in ways that we've never seen before, because they're in the way of access to dozens or hundreds, maybe thousands of customers' networks. And threat actors definitely see, you know, an MSP, especially a vulnerable MSP, is a great way to get the initial vector into multiple victims' networks and have sort of globally cascading effects. So I think, I mean, if you read down a lot of the directives out there, it's the basic stuff. I mean, like, I don't want to be too much of a plug for DNSFilter, but I mean, I think definitely it's obvious to me that securing the DNS layer is critically important. It's one of the huge tools you can have for defending against, you know, phishing attacks, malware, things like that. There's, I think, the improvement of security of vulnerable devices is something that MSPs maybe in general aren't really considering a lot of times, especially those IoT devices that may be sitting in their customers' networks. You know, and education. I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, education of the customer is one of the biggest possible things you could do. I think it's really important to understand that when you're talking to your customer and they ask you that question of like, how will you stop this from happening to my business? You also need to have the answer of sort of, well, what are you going to do? You know, you need to do your part in assisting me to do that for you as well.
Yeah, well, it's a two-way street. With our CEO, so you wear the CEO hat. You know, with our CEO, I've worked to condition him to talk about when something happens, not if, because then it changes that mindset of we're going to do everything we can, like everything we can to protect the organization, make sure that we prevent these things from happening. But when something happens, we have the right things in place. We're able to, you know, recover our data. We have plans in place. We know what you want to recover first. All those things, because you know, that is one of those things that I think most folks don't account for. Again, this is personal, just my observations, but it's like, all right, we're going to go recover the network. And you take like somebody like IHG, like they just had an event, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And they're still working to recover their servers. You know, I'm sure they had a very sophisticated plan for what they're going to do, how they're going to do it. And, you know, but it's weeks and weeks of work to get all of that infrastructure back. I think, you know, and that's part, to your point, that's part of that conversation that helps MSPs understand and their customers understand it is a two-way street that both of those folks need to work down. So question for you, I know you said you don't want to be a product plug, but I am kind of genuinely curious about this. You talk about these different threats and how they evolve and things like that. And you know, like DNS being the telephone book of the internet, you know, it's one of the most critical pieces. How do you guys keep on top of that, like from a threat research perspective or things like that? Like I go back in my experience, you know, it used to be like, all right, we go detonate malware, we go buy threat feeds, we would kind of do all the basic good hygiene, and that's what we would deploy. But technology has evolved so much in the last 10 years. Like I'm sure you guys have access to things that really gives you a competitive advantage. So what are those things you guys are doing to help kind of keep ahead of those threats as they evolve?
Yeah, well, sure. I think first off, I'm just continuously shocked by the amount of MSPs that, at least according to like our data and surveys that we perform, just have kind of completely ignored the DNS layer from a security perspective. It's mind-boggling to me, because there's, you know, roughly 70% of threats at one point or another do traverse the DNS layer at some point in their life cycle. So it's one of the largest surface areas to protect. It's lightweight, it's effective, and it doesn't really cost much. So I feel like it's just a really huge level of protection, and actually one of the most valuable indicators also for tracking down an attack or attempted attacks before or after they're occurring. Like especially when we talk to our enterprise customers, like the SIM data that you can put out of DNSFilter or anything theoretically DNS product, is one of the most critical aspects of data for their security operations center. So yeah, all that to be said, it has changed a lot since we started. So like I started DNSFilter in 2015. I thought it was like, oh, we're just gonna, build a DNS service, buy some threat feeds, some categorization feeds or something like that, and we're gonna be good to go. That's definitely not the case. So we started off as a customer of a company called WebShrinker that they were providing us domain categorization data, like, is this a porn site? Is it a business site? Not really so much threat stuff. So we were a customer of theirs. We acquired them in 2018 and leveraged, they were doing a lot with machine learning to do domain categorization. So we thought, it looks like there's a huge opportunity here to leverage that technology to do the same for threat data. So, it honestly started off as a cost saving measure for us to not have to pay for the feeds. But today, I mean, we've built it out to the point where, we do over 1 trillion DNS requests a month at this point. And we've been able to build out our ML models internally to the point where we now identify about 70% of all threats. 70% of all threats we see, we've identified them in-house first. The other 30% are from the about a little over 100 different threat feeds that we do buy, partner with, import, whatever you want to call it. So if you look at those two sides of things, you've got sort of what we do internally, and then you've got 30%, let's call it, of what we bring in externally. On the internal side, it's nuts. I mean, there's, I think, close to 90 different indicators that we look at whenever we categorize a domain. So it starts off by looking at actual customer activity. I'll say those trillion requests that we see. That's usually where we're going to see something for the first time, I'll say. Like a domain that comes in that's uncategorized, we've never seen it before, we don't know what it is. At that point, there's a feature that we have the ability to categorize in nearly real time. So we have a feature where a customer can turn it on, called the interstitial page, and it'll hold somebody at a page for a few seconds while we go and scan it in real time, make a decision, what category it's in, and then based on their policy, allow them to go or not. But even if a customer's not using that feature, we will still, when we see something for the first time, go and crawl it and categorize it in the background. And when we do that, we're looking at everything from its IP, who owns the IP, who's owned it in the past, is it shared resources, the who is stuff, the content on the page. We even get down to the level of doing image analysis. So we'll take we have screenshots and versions of logos for the top several thousand organizations in the world. We'll take a screenshot of a page and compare it to like a known version of a page or the logo from that organization and find a ton of stuff that way. Like, at first you could sort of do it by the text on the page. There would often be misspellings or I don't know, whatever it might be. Yeah. And then I'll say in like 2020, there became a lot of changes that people were doing it through images and styles. So like basically it would get around like vectors, that it would get around actually being able to scan the text on the page. So now that image analysis is a huge way that we find a ton of stuff early, detecting phone numbers on a page and, for certain like deceptive or phishing scams and seeing who the numbers are registered to. It's a ton of stuff. And that's just on the internal side. So we have, I think we have 17 people here now working on the data science team just doing that. And then you've got the external threat feed side. That's a whole nother challenge. So you've got, I think it's like 112 threat feeds that we import as a third party. So those you can't just trust them necessarily, and also they never really agree with each other. So you might have, let's say, 50 that say it's good and 50 that say it's bad or something like that. So we have to look at basically what is our categorization for that domain. What are the hit rates of all of these feeds in like their false positive rates. Everything goes into this system called CAL, and it's like ML over the third party feed. So it looks at our decisions, their false positive rates, who's saying what, the timing everything was reported at, and basically makes a decision, based off of all that. So it's sort of 2 layers of machine learning depending on where stuff gets reported from.
That's awesome. Can I look at some of the data you guys are looking at, this trillion events a day? That just sounds like my happy place, like doing data analysis with things like that. That's pretty amazing.
It's pretty cool. You get some, I mean, we service a lot of MSPs, but we have a lot of customers that you wouldn't even think of. I mean, there's over 1 million homes that we service through like, there's a router manufacturers, what I could say, that uses us to do like a subscription service. There's a satellite internet provider that that is a customer of ours. We were being used earlier this year to stop like Russian bad actors in Ukraine taking down the satellite internet network. I mean, we see a ton of stuff.
That's awesome. So it's interesting, like you guys have this very unique purview, like you're looking at both internet users, you're looking at enterprises. We go back over the last 2 years. So, COVID started 2.5 years ago, roughly. How did you see kind of the threat landscape pivot, or did you guys see anything pivot from a product perspective as everybody went home? Because everybody, when you go to an office, you've got all your controls, we've got all these things, we're all good. And then like, literally it was like, all right, hey, everybody, we're going to try this work remote thing. We're going to do it for, 1.5 years, 2 years. But what did you guys see, kind of in your data? Do you see things change? Do you see things pop up? I'm sure you saw like COVID related stuff, but I'm just kind of curious, what were you guys seeing as we all went through that?
Yep. Yeah, well, for one thing, as a business owner, I kind of just crossed my fingers. I didn't know what was going to happen then to us, but it worked out well. And we were already sort of set up. I mean, first of all, we're an all remote company, actually. Okay. Just not that it matters to the question, but we are about 140 people, and we've been all remote the entire time. So for us, we were all set. I think because of that, and because of the product and how it was designed for protecting people regardless of where they are, we didn't have to make a ton of product changes. I mean, we already had a global NACast network that worked out fine. But in terms of the threats that we saw, I mean, obviously we saw a lot more customers coming looking for a product like this. But the threats that we saw, yeah, it climbed up dramatically. I mean, I think in the first 2 years, each year we saw like 350% year over year increase in phishing attempts. Every single year for the past couple years has been over 200% increase in malware events that we've seen, and the types definitely changed too. So obviously we have a huge customer base of all different types. So I can't say it's completely representative of what businesses saw only, but tons of COVID and news related phishing attempts, like dramatic. Every single time there was some event that occurred, and it just got worse over time. I could share the threat report at some point, but yeah, huge spikes. Every time there was any sort of global event going on, COVID was, I'll say, in my mind, sort of the first event around that we saw. But then everything subsequently thereafter related to the election, to Ukraine. I mean, it's like commonplace to a degree that's probably 5 to 10 times worse than it was with COVID, especially when you look at like the vaccines. Like literally the amount of traffic related to Ukraine-based phishing attempts and deceptive sites was like 10 times that of what we saw with the vaccines, even though, you know, vaccines was more globally, I mean, it affected more people globally.
Interesting.
So also though, like the spear phishing attempts and phishing attempts dramatically increase. I mean, it's just my hypothesis, I believe, that I think that now that people are out of the office, there's just it's like a more greenfield opportunity for threat actors, right? Like, you know, I'm not going to be sitting there in the office with you, so how do they really know? I mean, obviously that's a whole nother topic, but how do they really know that, like, it would be more perceived that you would get like a text message from Ken because Ken can't talk to you there in the office, you know, or an email, or it's just, we're not there to kind of check on each other, you know,
Yeah, we saw I personally got a text message from John Palioku, who is our CEO. Well, I guess I should say John Palioku, who is our CEO, asking me to buy him gift cards, and I was a very difficult customer, which was super fun. I'm happy to share the transcript with you at some point, but ultimately, we definitely see it, and we definitely see it internally. How much? It's interesting. You mentioned earlier you're talking about you're kind of fingerprinting those organizational, you know, websites and what they look like and things like that, and like this huge increase in phishing. Are you guys able to capture like phishing attacks targeting your specific customers where they're doing things like that to help protect them against that? Like the example I'll give you is we had a group of users inside our organization who was targeted. It was a phishing campaign. Those specific users, when they set up the credit harvesting site, they used all of our branding, they used all of our images, things like that. You mentioned like, yeah, there's a huge increase in phishing. Like, how are those types of attacks things that you guys are able to detect and protect against?
Could you clarify? Like, are you saying, so for example, if Enable was a customer of ours, like, would we be able to sort of alert Enable to their likeness being used somewhere else on the internet?
Are you guys doing that for customers today? Is that a place that you guys play? Is it mostly focused on kind of domain activity and uniqueness of domains and specific target? I'm just kind of curious.
I mean, if it's not like a setup process, I'll say, or product offering. I mean, if we saw a notable customer like NVIDIA is a customer of ours, if we saw their likeness being used, you know, we would probably tell them, but it's not like an actual dedicated service that we provide now. Probably just a function of, you know, we're not in a huge amount of like Fortune 500s yet. But yeah, it's something we've talked about.
Yeah, I think you also would get it based upon all those other artifacts you're pulling in. So you're pulling in, you know, the 30% you get from the threat intelligence. You're also pulling in all the uniqueness across the board. So that artifact, I was just kind of curious how you guys had handled that in general.
Sort of ad hoc.
Yeah. So what have you guys seen, you know, with the pivot to cloud? Because it's so easy now to set up cloud services. Like anybody can get an Amazon account. I always joked at my old company, like, yeah, it's Oprah. You know, you get an Amazon account, you get an Amazon account, but threat actors leverage that same infrastructure. How do you guys handle targeting of that, whether it's, you know, any of the big players, or there's lots of kind of secondary players who are a little bit easier to work with, especially from an abuse perspective? How are you detecting threats there?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a challenge, you know, no doubt about it. Like that's what I was saying before with the landscape changing. I mean, these services can absolutely be fully legitimate, but also a place where, you know, this stuff could be hosted. So
yep.
It's a tough call. It's the reason I say that is because if we use, I don't know, Dropbox as an example, if, you know, Dropbox, obviously a heavily used service. You're not going to, when you're operating like us at the domain level, right now we can't necessarily, we can't block dropbox.com/z/ you know, whatever bad URL. We can decide to block dropbox.com or not. Yep. So the best way that we can combat it today is like we have the ability to identify applications that are allowed to be used by an organization. So it's called app aware. So like the best thing we could say is to, only enable the file sharing applications that, for example, you'd want to be allowed to be used in the organization. And that's basically the best we can do right now. I mean, we have the ability to detect at the full URL level, and we would report that to these providers and actually to some of the other third-party lists for takedown, but we can't block the full URLs yet. So that's a lot where, I don't know if you saw, but we acquired a company called Guardian about like a month ago, maybe 5 weeks ago. And that's exactly why we acquired them, is to sort of get deeper into start doing full URL, like file type blocking, IP level blocking, to take it sort of to the next level.
Okay, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I was even thinking just like infrastructure is so disposable now too. Like, so not even thinking about Dropbox, but I can go post a domain, I can post something up in Amazon, and then when Amazon shuts me down, I can move to Microsoft, and then I can move to, DigitalOcean, or I can move all. That's kind of the benefit of DNS, but the downside from a threat perspective. Do you guys do much where you look at domains that are constantly kind of moving across the internet?
Oh, yeah.
And what becomes the indicator? Not that we want to give away secret sauce, but like those types of attackers where they constantly are on the move. How do you keep up with them?
For sure. I mean, something changes geographically too frequently, entire vendors differently. Those are things that are definitely red flags. I mean, another thing that we look at, like we're actually like constantly refreshing the database too. So it's not actually just like scan it and then it's a dentist's website and it's all good and that's it. We're actually constantly refreshing the database also based on the content on the page as well. Well, not just the content, but a bunch of other stuff. So, I mean, like one good example I like to use is there's a lot of, I'm not sure what they actually call the, if it is a type of attack, I don't know the name for it, but basically you've got a site that, today it's a dentist's website, right? The dentist retires next week, sort of goes out of business, lets the domain expire in a year or a week or whatever it is. Then somebody else, a bad actor, picks that domain up and they live off of the reputation of, what the domain previously was. So that's, for example, something that we see quite often that we have to combat. And that's why we're constantly refreshing our categorizations, that just because it's legitimate today doesn't mean it's bad tomorrow. And the same thing of like, just because maybe a WordPress site got infected today doesn't mean it's still malicious tomorrow. So you're constantly changing back and forth in both directions.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I hadn't really thought about the going, I don't want to say going out of business, going into retirement phase of organizations and kind of how that looks from a DNS perspective. But that makes total sense that they would target it because you're not new.
Yeah, I mean, these are all of the things that I definitely did not think of when we first started that we would have to do later.
Yeah, well, it's the benefit of a growing. But I mean, you're what? You're about to hit eight years.
Let's
7
see.
years.
Yeah, 7. We're turning 7 probably in a couple days, actually. So yeah, I think we're like a week away from our 7th birthday.
So you're a weathered veteran now.
Yeah.
So you've been through it for a while. So as we talk about kind of all these different threat actors and kind of how they've evolved, on the MSP side of the house specifically, what are you guys? Because again, you service that market quite a bit. I mean, I know you guys are big there. You're servicing all these different, kind of players. How do you see kind of the value proposition to MSPs to support their customers? Because that to me is, I think it's kind of that constant battle of, I want to invest in something. We talked earlier about how do I make sure that I'm protected against this threat, from a solution perspective, as you go through that with your customers. How does that talk track go to help your MSPs be more effective in kind of solutioning your solution to their customers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, To be quite honest, it's something that we're constantly working on and looking to improve by the end of this year, because I think that we could do a better job of actually educating our MSP customers on it. We've definitely taken the product route of just like sort of taking feedback and building what they're asking for, but now it's time to, I think, give back in that sense a little bit. And I think the statistics kind of speak for themselves. I think there's a story to put together around, like, again, literally everything on the internet goes through DNS. Like I don't even care if you use DNSFilter or not. I just, like, I can't believe you wouldn't use something, you know?
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously some are better than others, but like it is just a layer that you cannot not address. So, but the statistics do speak to themselves, like that again, 70% of all threats are at some point going to traverse the DNS layer. There's so much you can do both proactively and reactively with the DNS data in case of an attack or an attempted attack.
Yep.
There's, I think, you know, I'm not like a huge stats guy, but these are just things that blow me away. That like 88% of businesses, whether they know it or not, did experience at least one DNS-based attack in the past year. It's just like, I think the education of how critical of a part of the infrastructure it is, essentially.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. I mean, I would guess that number is higher than 88%. It's just the other 12%, are they aware of the event or not? But similar to your point, like I'm a car guy, so like I've been going through car analysis lately. But you know, like you think about it, you go back 30, 40 years, like cars, all right, we have seat belts, and then you know, you fast forward a little bit, and like we have airbags, and all these things are putting in kind of protections for when a security event or when a physical event happens. Like, you know, my truck, my kids call it out all the time. They're like, your seat belt has an airbag in the back seat. I'm like, yeah. They're like, why? I'm like, because if we have an accident, it's here to protect us. And like to your point, being from a DNS perspective, like that's an underlying system that like anti-lock brakes or anything else for a car that helps you to really stop a little bit faster and you're not skidding or anything like that. But you know, as you talked about kind of the post-event investigation, which is probably where I've spent most of my time. I've lived off DNS, like that gives you all the artifacts of who called what and when and how and why, and like we live off of it today. So I definitely kind of agree with that. In terms of like that data and having that data available, like for your customers, is that something that they can pipe into a SIM? Is it something they can access in your UI easily? Like how do you enable incident responders? I mean, I know this is not necessarily MSP specific, but like how do you help IR folks kind of drive down that investigative process for when something happens? Because again, I'm big on like when it happens, not if. So how are some of the tools you guys have instrumented to support those folks? Because they're absolutely critical for when it happens.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I have to admit I didn't even until a few years ago probably understand how valuable it was, because I never really had to spend a lot of time on the IR incident response side of things. But whenever we go into like an enterprise specifically these days that they do leverage this data, it's always like the decision maker is actually like the security operations team. Like if we don't put out the data that's useful for them, then they basically can nix the entire project and call the whole proof of concept off, you know? So we have worked on that a lot. We have, the answer to your question is yes, you can do it in app and out of app. So we have something called query log, which it's, you know, depending on the offering, it can go, I think, up to 9 days long, where you can literally see every single DNS query that comes through in basically in real time. You can export that data via CSV, you know. Then we did launch a SIM integration, which is really what people love. So either, you know, we support Splunk with the HTTPS collector. We're about to be rolling out many more that basically anybody else who supports HTTP collection. But then also there's just the S3 too. So we integrate with Amazon S3, where you can export it to S3. Some people are doing that to then import it into a SIM or another tool. Some people are doing both. Some people are doing just S3 for like historical logs purposes, even, you know, just good to collect, even if you're not going to do something with it, like keep it for a bit.
Well, you don't know that you need it usually immediately. Like that's it's been my experience. Like oftentimes, like, all right, we had a security event, and it's like, when did it happen? Well, it happened, you know, months ago. And if you don't have that historical data, you know, like in our case, so we're a Splunk shop. So we keep, you know, I don't keep just 30 days of data. We want to keep 3, 6, 9, 12 months, whatever we can, pretty much as much as John will let me spend. So I would say also, just to add to your not having been through the incident response stuff before, be happy, because this is where all the gray comes from. Like I've accrued that over the last, 20 years of doing this, but it does make for quite a bit of benefit for organizations as they go through that. I definitely understand, like from a SOC perspective, that wanting to have that input into the project, because I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I mean, it's kind of crazy. Like from a really basic perspective, like even just looking at our dashboard, or I'm you know, to stay agnostic, I'm sure any DNS products dashboard possibly, you know, you can just look and see by query activity, like filter out all the stuff that you think, you know, may not be threats. I mean, I guess that depends on how accurate your tool is, but
Sure.
basically you can see like a clear spike, like, oh, something happened here, and then you dive in, oh, it's this domain, and then you're able to dive in, well, who accessed that domain and on what device and at what time, and to your point, it just helps track things down. Yeah, it's
finding the needles.
Yeah,
That's always
it's
what
like
we
the
called it.
start. So I honestly don't know if you weren't keeping DNS logs, at least, like, I don't actually know. I've never had to do that for a job, but I don't know where you would actually start, to be honest.
So it's an interesting pivot, especially post-COVID. Like, I look at it as an enterprise guy. You know, I moved my entire SOC, I moved my entire team, we went full remote. And from a business perspective, we were pretty largely heavily dependent on a VPN. But what I've seen over the last 2 years is, like, VPNs, I don't want to say they're dead, but they're dying. Like, everybody's moved to SaaS solutions. Everybody's moving kind of into this distributed model. And now, today, I think it'd be very difficult to find this type of information without a solution that's doing it kind of at the endpoint, because all those controls that you have internally, like before, where I could go and, you know, we used Infobox, so I could grab all the Infobox logs, I could throw them all into Splunk, I could see all the things. Well, now Infobox has, you know, the handful of people we have in the office, it has all of our servers and other things, but all those endpoints that are out on the internet are far harder to track. So I think it's actually gotten harder to effectively do this in the last, you know, 24 months. And I candidly think it's here to stay. I mean, you know, I know what we're seeing in the marketplace, just as we interview folks for my team and elsewhere. People are, you know, they want to be remote. They want to have the flexibility of, you know, being able to go pick their kids up from the school bus. You know, I'm guilty of that, and I love it. So, so I definitely, the challenge will continue. I don't see any way around it.
Yeah, I mean, even if it wasn't here to stay, it's going to take at least, I mean, I think it'll take at least twice as long as it took to make the change to get here as it will to go back. So, you know, and in the world of cyber, like, that's an eternity, right? So you have to deal with it.
Well, I mean, for us, I think it took us 3 days from when, like, we decided we were going fully remote to being fully remote. So,
well, I don't mean it's going to take 6 to go back. I mean, like, we're used to
years
this now.
away. Yeah. We are. I live in Atlanta, so ironically, the traffic is back to pre-pandemic chaos. So, being somebody who doesn't have to go sit in traffic every day, I'm appreciative of that. But I think it'll be a balance, or you're gonna have people going in kind of so many days a week and things like that. You know, we talked a lot today about, you know, kind of historically, you know, the percentage of attacks coming through DNS, things like that. What do you kind of see in the future? I mean, you know, we've been talking about kind of the past, but what do you see over the next, you know, 3 to 5 years from a DNS perspective, and how attackers will continue to leverage that technology to exploit folks?
Well, I think it's going to mainly come down to the data side of things. I don't personally see a ton changing in the types of attacks necessarily, but I definitely think the complexity and the scale at which they can be complex will continue to grow dramatically. You know, it's not going to be, they won't sort of, they have to leverage their resources, I think, right now to target like a few key people within the organization, I'll say. I think that there's going to be ways for basically everybody to be targeted. The scale complexity will just dramatically increase. I think, you know, something that we're talking about here a bit, you know, like I told you before we started, this is like in the infancy phase, I'll say right now. But I'm noticing that there's increasingly, it feels like over the last year, even though MFA options are at an all-time high, it's like SMS-based attacks are just, I think, dramatically increasing. Like even you look at the most recent Uber event, I mean, it kind of comes down to that. You know, I see on the Reddit forum, like on Reddit, the MSP subreddit and some other subreddits, there are people asking like, what do you do for, you know, these to protect against these attacks? Nobody really has a good answer other than education, and that's obviously not working 100% of the time.
Yeah.
So the answer is I don't know. I think we'll see more of that, and it's easy to say, well, just don't allow it. But there's a lot of tools that don't allow you to disable SMS, or that's all they offer. So I personally think that that's something that we're going to spend some time on, at least at DNSFilter.
Yeah, I think we definitely see, and again, I don't know the details for what happened with Uber or Rockstar or anything like that, but even looking at, like, we've tracked it in the past, like crypto account takeovers, like that was all done via SMS kind of abuse and taking over in order to bypass two-factor. So definitely agree that it's an attack vector that's being beaten. It's just a matter of
The Uber thing came down, it seems like, to a combination of two different things. There was a contractor who basically had his, you know, bad password, got leaked, didn't change it enough, ended up on the dark web. So they got that. And then for the MFA portion, it became an SMS attack, just overwhelming him or her with MFA requests until they finally gave in, and that's how they got access. So it was a combination of things, and I think that speaks to sort of the complexity of the attacks that are happening now. Like nobody, I don't want to say nobody, but it just feels like people are much less actually having to brute force their way into systems anymore, and it's completely, you know, much more intelligent than that, I'll say, these days.
Well, I mean, you only have to find one individual who, like, to your point.
Yeah.
You berate somebody with like, all right, approve this, and they finally like, all right, fine. I don't know who's asking for this, but leave me alone.
Yeah.
And you know, it's like that they're conditioned at a certain point to like stop hitting the snooze button on the alarm. Like, not that I would ever do that, but
yeah. But you know, I'll just say, to speak to that, by the way, for like MSPs, so something that we do here, and I now see some other MSPs doing this on this topic, or any sort of phishing, I'll say, type topic, that works, is like, I mean, I literally get 10 or 15 of these a week to people who work at DNSFilter, pretending to be me, asking them to buy a gift card, or I don't know, you know, whatever it may be. We started a Slack channel, you know, so we of course educate all of our employees, but we also say anytime something like this happens, particularly for an executive like myself or COO or chief product officer or whatever, send it to the Slack channel and we'll archive it. I mean, we'll use it for our own machine learning, of course, but it just gets people into a rhythm to recognize that this is bad. They see the other employees do it and they report it. So I've seen it work very well, where some MSPs open up, you know, a Teams channel or a Slack channel with their customer and kind of have them do the same thing, but reporting it to the MSP as a great point of education beyond what they might be doing with, training and so forth.
Yeah, we try to do the training, but to your point, I think it's also driving the awareness, because this happens more and more. Ironically, we've actually had like our PR firm be hit with texts from John asking for the same thing. So they're not even just kind of
That's
keeping
dangerous.
with our organization anymore. It's like they're kind of expanding further and further. I'm like, well, it's interesting. I don't know why they would go do this for you, but like all the power to you.
Well, that's like a mini supply chain, right? I mean, imagine I mean, I don't know, but like, yeah, Enable's publicly traded, right? Like if they put out the wrong bit of news or whatever and had listened to whoever sent that message, I mean, yeah, there are things you could do. I mean, it's crazy.
That's why I'm shocked they're trying to get gift cards. I'm like, to your point, there's so many more malicious things you could do. Maybe that's my mind. I'm a jaded old security guy. I'm like, all right, like if I was going to leverage this, how many evil things could I do? And it wouldn't be asking for an Amazon or an Apple or eBay. I think the last one I got was eBay. Like, so I'm 100% with you. I mean, how do we put those things out, and how do we protect those users? And again, for us, to your point, being publicly traded, is that expanded supply chain and protecting them too, because we don't want that to happen. Or whether they're targeting finance, trying to change where we're routing funds, things like that. All those, I think we're seeing, they've been in the business for a while, or potentially impacting the business. So. Jay, I'm going to ask you real quick. Have we had any questions kind of come in?
Yeah, you guys have done a great job at answering some of these. One that you haven't really covered, and a little technical for me, but it was around growing adoption of technologies to help secure DNS weaknesses, like DNSSEC, DANE, like things like that. Like, what are you seeing, in and around DNS being around for decades, right? And the weaknesses, the security weaknesses it has in general as a protocol. What are you seeing, around that, kind of trying to secure that technology?
Yeah, that's sort of pretty open question, but I think, yeah, I mean, we see a lot of adoption of DNSSEC. We see a lot of importance for us to work well with DOT. So I'm not sure how to further answer that question, but
yeah, he was just asking, like, are you seeing those sorts of things picking up or being adopted, or just growing in that direction, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, particularly DNSSEC, encrypted DNS. I mean, it's a huge growth for us. I mean, that's if it tells you anything, like DNS over TLS now is the standard for us. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you guys answered SIM. That was a question about integration, right? I mean, we see that too, Dave. I think on our EDR side, right? Having those data feeds into their SIMs or their XDR platforms is becoming more and more important, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, so we're approaching time, and just before we end here, we definitely want to pop some polls up real quick, and we just want to thank Dave and Ken. This was awesome. I actually learned a lot. I appreciate it. I worked at an MSP for ISP, so I lived in the world of DNS for many years. It's quite ugly, but DNSFilter makes it very easy. We've got some folks that want to actually see the product. They were asking to see the product here, and so we're going to get folks on a demo. But you'll be very impressed by DNSFilter's product. I'm very impressed with it. So.
Sorry we didn't have any demos. Yeah, we try to keep away from being salesy. So
no, and that's fine. So
but yeah, if they want to check it out, reach out to Enable or us. Be happy to show you.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm just popping that up real quick here. So we got one more poll, but just want to again, thank you, Ken and Dave. This great webinar. We had a lot of people stay on through the whole thing, which is great, and definitely want to do more of these with you all. And I think your conversation was like almost more of a podcast. It felt really healthy. Like the dynamics were really good back and forth. So just hats off to you two, and appreciate everyone's time. answer one more poll, folks, and then we'll let you go. But we've got a lot of webinars coming up, and one particularly around Cove and ransomware. If you haven't been following us, we're doing a lot of topics around cybersecurity and ransomware. So check us out on LinkedIn and so forth. But getting ready to close the last poll. Again, thanks everyone. Have a great day. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks all. It was fun.
We'll have to talk about cars, by the way, David.
that we can do. All right. Thank
And
you
it will
all.
be a true